happy to be with you all to discuss these very interesting papers that I think have a lot of insights for us in economics. Let me say up front that although I'm a professor of economics, I am not a macroeconomist by any stretch. So I'm going to bring up the stuff that I think we should be very aware of in economics, and hopefully some discussion points that will stimulate more discussion in the Q&A as well. So let me start with Sam's paper. Although I think a lot of these points are more general to both papers in terms of the value of cognitive science for economics. I think there's a very legitimate critique of behavioral economics that comes from the actual term. And actually, I have to say that I moved to LSE just 2 years ago from the US, and I was struck by the way in which behavioral economics was viewed here. So it is very much more of a version of behavioral economics that is stimulus response. And I think a lot of that is because of the nudge work. I think it actually has potentially missed the broader variety of what in the economics department we call psychology and economics. And so at the end of my discussion, I'm going to talk a lot about the kind of frontier of this research, which actually takes into account a lot of what both of our speakers have talked about, as well as the previous session, which I think is really exciting in terms of what's happening. And this also addresses another critique that Sam didn't make in his presentation, but was very much in his paper about the field experiments, which have tended to, as well as sort of all empirical work, a lot of empirical work in behavioral economics, that have tended to sort of take off the shelf things like biases and try to apply them in some way and just look at behavior rather than really trying to understand mechanisms. So I'm very much at the point that we do need to really return to the value of lab experiments to be able to understand these mechanisms. Okay, so this sort of point about sense making, that is the way that we humans kind of understand data, super important. So the first point about heuristics that are often used rather than Bayesian maximization. The only point I want to make here is that there's been a lot of work on heuristics. But one thing that's very striking is that you take the gray swans example, where people were exhibiting all or nothing thinking. Right? All or nothing thinking is a very well-established psychological bias. The interesting thing is that there's also very well-established evidence that it is possible to educate people out of that bias. So cognitive behavioral therapy, which is now used not only for people who have depression or panic attacks or anything, but really much more broadly, is precisely a method of helping people to gather evidence from their own environment, and both from their past as well as to go out and experiment and collect more data to be able to update their beliefs and create, in particular on one of these biases, a more nuanced understanding of the distribution of probabilities in their environment, just because it's so easy to go to all or nothing thinking. And there are actually just a plethora of now field experiments who are using CBT to address many kinds of social challenges. But I think that the evidence from that should give us some hope that in fact there may be some, if we understand that this is the way people think, there may be a way of presenting information that could make it easier or less easy to update properly about and not fall into all or nothing thinking. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in one experiment that I'm going to talk about later on. Okay, so then take the second point about constructing narratives, which we've heard a lot about today. So this, I think, is incredibly important and something that has started to make its way into economics, and we're sort of really fascinated by it, but don't really understand. And I think the point that came up actually in the question in the middle about framing is very important, because to some extent, what we do with framing, or any of the priming experiments that I'm sure many of you are familiar with, that prime certain identities, is just if you have, for example, a conflicting narrative in yourself about what kind of identity you hold. What a frame does, or a prime does, is just trigger one of those narratives versus the other. So a kind of famous example of this is a paper by Ernst Fair and others, where they had people do tasks where they could be dishonest in lab experiments. And in one of the treatments, they triggered their professional identity. So they told them that they were a teacher, you're a teacher, you're a doctor, you're a banker. When the bankers were triggered with their professional identity, they were much more dishonest. in the task. This is not the case for other professional identities. So these are the same people, right? So this is a within subject rule. So what this is telling you is that we do have multiple identities and multiple narratives about who we are. And depending on whether we go into work and we are treated, expected to act in a certain way, or anything else could trigger one of those narratives, we will act differently. We will consider differently what our optimal actions should be. Okay, and then the third aspect of this that Sam didn't get to talk about, but I think is actually very relevant for us, is on intuitive theories. So these are more about how lay people come to think about economics. And in particular, the sort of something which is very pronounced in psychology on fixed pie bias, but the only work in economics that I know is of Nathan Nunn and others. There's some work starting on this. It's very, very recent. If others know others, it would be great, because I think there is a kind of fixed pie bias where the focus of lay people is much more on distribution than on production and on getting to the efficient frontier. And of course that makes discussions about, and that's very opposite from how economists think, and so that makes discussions about trade, for example, and globalization quite difficult. And that this might come from a kind of, what some call intuitive mercantilism, where money equals wealth, and that this very strong intuitions that people seem to have about economics, that are really wrong, that in a few classes in economics we try to really shift with them, may come from an evolutionary perspective where it may come from having been in hunter-gatherer societies and not been as exposed over time to the kind of market exchange. It's just one idea, but I think what this triggered in me was the responsibility of us as economists in understanding how lay people create their views of economics so that we can communicate properly. When I moved to London was when the Brexit vote was happening, and I was really struck by the way in which we were having so much difficulty as economists in communicating the costs of this to lay people, and people had such strong intuitions. And I think in our department we've talked a lot about what our responsibility is in that discourse. So that's just one thing to put out there as something that I think all of us could think a lot more about. Okay, so to Henry's paper. So going back to heuristics and the way in which actually heuristics can be very powerful and actually useful for us and not really a problem. In fact, they would be much better. He didn't talk about the one over n, but that's a really perfect example of this. And the higher bias, lower variance, very important. The bias. While I take the point that there are many circumstances where uncertainty is unquantifiable, I think it's very important to think, again, and I think this is a symptom of the first problem that I mentioned, that heuristics within sort of the psychology and economics literature have actually been treated pretty sophisticatedly. So again, as we think about sort of lay behavioral science or lay behavioral economics, there's a kind of label. I agree. They're kind of labeled heuristics that are difficult to test. But if you think about Matthew Rabin's 2002 paper about law of small numbers, if you think about the extensive papers that have come out by Giannulli and Schleifer, these are really deep models that are testable and that take biases very seriously as a potentially efficient way of thinking, and that's sort of a very, very rich literature right now on the frontier of psychology and economics and behavioral economics, on how agents develop beliefs and form expectations. So this is just a few of the papers, but Andy Kaplan has a fantastic review of the work in attention. I'm going to talk a little bit about Josh Schwarzstein's papers, but there's really a lot in this area that has just been exploding, and it's really on the frontier. One paper that I really like is a field experiment that takes the process of cognitive decision-making very, very seriously. So this is a paper by Rima Hanna, Sandal Mulanathan, and Josh Schwarzstein, which uses, Josh Schwarzstein has an earlier paper that is just the model. This takes it to field data with Indonesian seaweed farmers. And basically, it's called learning by noticing, because the idea is that, so we have rational inattention, which is basically that agents have access to all information, but they can't attend to it all, okay, because of computing constraints and information constraints, but they rationally decide what to attend to. right? I think that's our standard way of looking at this. The learning by noticing model suggests that actually it's not a perfectly rational process of what to attend to. That you actually don't attend to very important variables. And in particular, what they find is they work with thousands of Indonesian seaweed farmers who have a tremendous amount of experience in seaweed farming. They're very, very inattentive, both in baseline and after participating in trials on their land itself, to an extremely important variable in their production capacity, which is pod size. So you take the seaweed, you put it in pods, and sort of what the actual size is. But then they do an intervention where they provide a summary of the pod size facts on their own plot. So again, these are farmers that have just done a trial on their own plots they've observed, but they just didn't notice this one change that they should have seen once, and they haven't over periods of time either that is common to their experience. But once the summary of the pod size is given to them in a particular form, it changes their behavior and their productivity increases. So it suggests that providing information in the right way that facilitates learning from data is particularly important in improving decisions. And I think a lot of our focus going forward should be both on trying to model and test the underlying processes of decision making, but also then thinking, what is an intervention that would actually change this? Because just to document that this is problematic in terms of productivity or growth is not, I think, should not be sufficient for us. And then this is another paper. I'll go very quickly through this just so I can get to the last point. But then this is sort of taking that theory a bit further, which is, so we may not notice information that could be very important to us, and so it's not an efficient sort of inattention, but also we really tend to not update beliefs based on information that conflicts with our priors. And so this is really trying to model very seriously the process of how you go about changing beliefs when you are presented with information that conflicts with your prior. And essentially, which is obviously very important for us in this world of siloed and partisan thinking, right? Where people have very, very strong priors and they're only getting information based on their priors. But what it suggests is that if you have new information that contradicts beliefs, if it's deemed important by the existing beliefs. So you can't function by dismissing the existing beliefs and then say, here's some additional data you should listen to. And this was very striking for me to read this paper, because I had been working at the time in Zambia, where there is a very high maternal mortality rate, but people had not been updating on the risk of maternal mortality, and that this had been worse among men than among women. So we had this situation where men really wanted many more kids than their wives did. And there was still a very high fertility rate in Zambia, which is a middle-income country, but average fertility is around 5. And a lot of this excess fertility is coming from the difference in preferences between husbands and wives, and that, we discovered, is coming from a lack of updating on the risk of maternal mortality. But when we started our intervention to say, let's teach you about the risk of maternal mortality, 1 in 27 women die in childbirth over their lifetime, all the men especially put up their hands and say, that's because the wives were promiscuous during childbirth, during pregnancy. That's the local belief, and that's the traditional belief. And actually, there's the local language word for obstructed labor is promiscuous during pregnancy. So that's how strong it is. And there could be many reasons. We have a P&P that talks about why these beliefs would arise. But then our original thing was to say, no, that's a myth. Let's show you the science. So we would show all the science of like how actually this happens, et.cetera. No updating of beliefs. Everybody would nod, and no updating of beliefs, and definitely no change in behavior. Then I said, well, and then I learned about how this intuition comes a little bit from psychology of thinking about difficulty of changing beliefs, and so I said to them, well, 1 in 110 women in South Africa die in childbirth, and they say, oh, those women are different. So that's still very consistent with their mental model, right? So that doesn't update their beliefs at all. And then I say 1 in 41 women in Zimbabwe are promiscuous during pregnancy. And they say, what? Wait a second. because their mental model is that women in Zimbabwe are more promiscuous than women in Zambia. And yet, what I've just showed them is that women are dying at a lower rate in Zimbabwe than they are in Zambia. So it is data that conflicts with their existing model. It takes their existing model in their mind seriously and says, wait a second, that has a little bit of conflict. And what that did was introduce like a chip in that prior to be able to allow for an updating of beliefs, to take in the new data. Now that is, the fact that the sequence of information would be different is not consistent with Bayesian updating. So right now we're trying to really deeply go under this process, but this model, I think, explains goes some way to explaining why that might happen. And you can see how important it could be in terms of social outcomes. So one last thing, if you give me just couple minutes. I think one thing I was very struck by in Sam's paper is the sort of, that there are many areas where cognitive science could help us, and one of those, I think through things in economics, and one of those is the sort of explosion in moral psychology within cognitive science, which has been really extraordinary. And so, David Rand has worked on a lot of papers on kind of humans being intuitively hardwired for cooperation. There's a bit of, controversy in that field about whether it's first nature or second nature to be cooperative. But the idea that this could actually be in our nature and it could be taken out of us by the environments we walk into is just an interesting idea for us to explore as economists. But in general, even as economics has over the last 30 years really taken seriously altruistic preferences and brought them into utility maximizing models, we have still sustained altruism as something that is an exogenous type. There are altruistic types and selfish types, and in particular, these are fixed over time. So the exception to that is intergenerational transmission. You try to make your kids more nicer to their friends, etc. But generally, we're thinking about types responding to incentives in a pretty static way. But this is very contradictory to an increasing amount of work in neuroscience, in which you can actually learn through mental training parts of your brain that are developed through, for example, meditation or attentional control increase. I'm not going to say much about this literature. I mean, I think there's many critiques you could make of it, but certainly the idea that as you repeatedly do something, it would affect the ease of doing it in the future is very consistent with what we know from, or what millennia of moral philosophy has suggested, which is that we are what we repeatedly do. And so that we have tried to bring into economics. This is actually with my colleague Oriana Bandeira in the department, where we try to take seriously what would it really mean if you were actually building this capacity over time, so that altruism isn't a preference necessarily or a type, but it's built over time. And we posit altruism as an asset that enables individuals to internalize the effect of their actions on others. Like other forms of capital, it can accumulate or deplete. So the key prediction is that the propensity to engage in altruistic acts is causally increased by prior altruistic behavior. That's very different from a lot of models out there. And it has some very it has a lot of different things that we might want to, we're trying to test right now. It's certainly in line with the work on beliefs and expectations. There's a big question of whether people misestimate their own enjoyment of altruistic actions. There's plenty of psych literature that shows we really underestimate how much it is to give to others. And if that is the case, then no matter what your motivation, we don't even need to worry about motivation. Just getting on that path of starting altruistic action could lead to significant learning and could lead over time to a kind of learning by doing habit formation that would lead to a difference in character. But knowing how we progress in economics, we are now trying to do very extensive, embedded in social organizations, field experiments as well as lab experiments to be able to provide data rigorously to actually test these ideas so that we can move forward.